The sun was sinking low over the horizon, casting a golden glow across the wide stretch of prairie. Dust swirled around a man's boots as he rode his horse closer to the ranch he once called home. His lips curled into a mocking smile. This place, this broken ranch, was the very reason he had walked away. It had been too much work, too much failure, too much disappointment, and now, years later, curiosity and arrogance dragged him back. He imagined her still the same, tired, desperate, and clinging to a life she couldn't manage. He pictured a ranch half collapsed, cattle gone, and fences falling apart. He chuckled to himself, muttering under his breath. She probably begged the neighbors for scraps just to keep going. Poor fool. But as his horse carried him closer, his smugness began to fade. The broken gates, he remembered, were gone, replaced by sturdy, polished wood. Where weeds had once strangled the land, green pastures stretched wide and healthy. Horses grazed with shining coats, and the sound of hammers echoed from a newly built barn. His eyes narrowed in disbelief, and then he saw her. She stood in the yard, commanding and confident, her hair catching the sunset's fire. No longer the weary woman he had left behind, she carried herself with a strength that startled him. A group of ranch hands worked nearby, taking her orders without hesitation. Her children, grown taller now, were riding strong horses, laughing as they raced one another across the pasture. The man's pride stung. He had left her broken, and yet before his eyes she was richer, stronger, and wilder than ever. He cleared his throat loudly, expecting her to notice him right away. In his mind, she would come running, either in anger or in desperate relief. Instead, she barely spared him a glance, her focus still on her workers. That single gesture cut him deeper than words ever could. He wasn't the center of her world anymore. He wasn't anything at all. When she finally turned to face him, her expression was calm, steady, and unreadable. Not a trace of weakness, not a flicker of regret. Her eyes locked on his, sharp and unflinching, as if to remind him that this was her land, her home, her triumph. The silence between them stretched, heavy and suffocating. He forced a smirk and muttered, well, seems the old ranch hasn't fallen apart yet. Surprising. His voice dripped with mockery, but deep inside, his confidence wavered. She didn't flinch. Instead, she simply crossed her arms and let the corner of her mouth curve into the faintest smile, the kind of smile that said she knew something he didn't. And in that moment, he realized the truth. The woman he had once mocked, the ranch he had once abandoned, had risen beyond his wildest imagination, and for the first time in years, he felt small. Long before her ex-husband returned with mocking eyes and a bitter tongue, this land had been her battlefield. When he left, the ranch wasn't just broken, it was nearly dead. The fences leaned like skeletons against the wind. The barns leaked rain with every storm, and the cattle, thin and sickly, were barely worth the feed they consumed. Neighbors whispered behind her back, their voices laced with pity. She won't last a winter without a man. Some even laughed openly, betting on how long before she sold the land or begged for help. But what hurt more than the gossip was the memory of his last words. Her ex-husband had stood on the porch with his bags packed, sneering at her as though she were a burden rather than his wife. You'll never make anything of this place. Without me, you're nothing. This ranch is nothing. And then, with a final cruel laugh, he left her in the dust. For nights afterward, she sat by the window with tears streaking her cheeks, watching storms roll across the sky. The weight of the ranch crushed her shoulders. She had no partner to share the burden, no father figure to guide the children, and no certainty of tomorrow. The only thing she had was the land, and even that seemed to reject her, its soil dry and unforgiving. Each morning, she rose before the sun, tying her hair back with trembling hands. The chores never ended, feeding cattle, hauling water, fixing broken fences. Her palms blistered, her back ached, and yet the work still seemed endless. More than once, exhaustion forced her to her knees in the dirt. Her children, young and wide-eyed, tried to help in whatever ways they could. Her eldest boy dragged heavy buckets of water, though his arms shook from the weight. Her daughter clutched tools nearly as big as she was, determined to mend small cracks in the chicken coop. They worked not because they were told to, but because they knew their mother's tears fell into the soil at night, and they could not bear to see her struggle alone. Still, there were days when despair nearly swallowed her whole. The pantry shelves grew bare. The last jar of beans stared back at her like a cruel joke. She considered selling the ranch, packing what little she had and leaving behind the land that had already taken so much. But then she'd see the faces of her children, tired yet hopeful, waiting for her to lead. And every time she shook off the weakness, gritted her teeth, and told herself, I will not let him be right. I will not let this ranch die. The community wasn't kind. When she went into town to trade for supplies, shopkeepers offered her lower prices, convinced she was desperate. Some men approached with smirks, suggesting she marry again quickly if she wanted to survive. Others laughed outright when her wagon wheel snapped on the dirt road, whispering, See? She's falling apart just like her ranch. But behind the humiliation, something fierce began to grow inside her. Each insult became fuel. Each doubt sharpened her resolve. She no longer worked to simply survive, she worked to prove them all wrong. So she learned. She read manuals on animal care and ranching techniques late into the night by the dim glow of a lantern. She bartered wisely, trading what little she had for better tools. She planted new seeds, tilled the stubborn soil with bleeding hands, and waited patiently for growth. And when crops finally pushed through the dirt, small and fragile, she wept with both relief and pride. It wasn't easy. Storms tore through the ranch, collapsing half of the old barn. She cried as rain poured into her children's beds. But the very next morning she was out in the mud, hammer in hand, rebuilding what had fallen. Wolves prowled the edges of her land, threatening her cattle. Instead of cowering, she stayed up with a rifle across her lap, watching through the dark until dawn. Every failure carved resilience into her bones. Every scar on her hands was a mark of survival. Her children began to notice. They didn't see a tired, broken mother anymore. They saw a warrior who refused to bow. They saw the way she held her chin high when the townsfolk sneered, the way she stood firm even as debts pressed in, the way she worked when most men would have walked away. And slowly, the ranch began to change. The land, once dry and hopeless, seemed to respond to her persistence. Crops grew taller. Cattle grew healthier. Neighbors, once quick to mock, now fell silent as they watched her endure storms they would never have survived. But still, in those early days, she carried the words of her ex-husband like thorns in her heart. Without me, you're nothing. Each day she fought to prove him wrong. Each night she dreamed of a future where her children would never again know the taste of shame or hunger. And though she didn't realize it yet, every drop of sweat, every tear in the soil, every hour of pain was forging her into someone unrecognizable, someone stronger, bolder, and wilder than the man who had walked away. The days of despair slowly gave way to something new, something fiercer. She no longer rose each morning just to survive. She rose to conquer. At first it was small victories, almost invisible to the outside world. A broken fence mended with her own hands. A calf nursed back to health after neighbors had sworn it wouldn't make it through the night. A wagon load of eggs traded in town for a fairer price because this time, she looked the shopkeeper dead in the eye and refused to be cheated. The woman who once trembled at the thought of standing alone was gone. In her place stood someone who had tasted humiliation and swallowed it down, only to grow stronger. She began to study the land, not just working it, but understanding it. She noticed how the sun hit certain fields longer, how the soil near the creek bed was richer, how the cattle grazed better when rotated across pastures. She turned her kitchen table into a desk, covered with ledgers and notes, teaching herself how to budget, trade, and invest. Every mistake became a lesson. Every failure a stepping stone. The townsfolk noticed too. They saw her in the market speaking firmly, trading with confidence. They saw her walk into the blacksmith's shop not as a desperate widow, but as a customer who knew exactly what she needed and how much it was worth. Some still whispered, but now the tone was different. There was less laughter, more unease, and soon there was admiration. Her children, once shy and hesitant, began to walk taller beside her. Her eldest son grew into a strong young man, riding the range at dawn, checking fences and herding cattle with skill. Her daughter took charge of the accounts, running numbers with the sharp mind of someone twice her age. The youngest followed along, eager to learn every lesson his mother taught. But it wasn't just her family that transformed, it was the ranch itself. The once barren fields began to bloom. She planted crops with patience, using every trick she learned from old books and neighbors' careless advice. Slowly, green shoots broke through the soil. The barn, once sagging under the weight of storms, stood tall and solid after months of hammering and patching. Cattle grew fatter, their hides gleaming under the sun. Horses ran strong and wild, their hooves thundering across the land as if celebrating her triumph. and with that growth came profit. The first time she sold cattle at a fair price, walking away with coins heavy in her pouch, she nearly wept, not from weakness but from pride. The money wasn't just currency, it was proof. Proof that she could not only survive without him, but she could thrive. She began to reinvest carefully. Better feed for the animals, stronger seed for the fields, hired hands when the work grew too heavy, and every decision was made with the sharpness of someone who had learned the hard way what failure cost. Soon, her name carried weight. In town, people spoke of the widow's ranch with a mix of awe and respect. Buyers came from farther away, drawn by the quality of her livestock. Neighbors who once mocked her now tipped their hats when she passed. Some even asked her advice. But while others saw only success, she knew the truth. Every ounce of progress was built on sweat, scars, and sheer willpower. Nights still found her awake under the lantern's glow, poring over books, running numbers, planning for tomorrow. And every dawn still pulled her from bed before the roosters crow. Her hands blistered but her spirit unbroken. One evening, as she stood on her porch, watching her children ride across the pasture, she realized something powerful. The ranch was no longer just a piece of land. It was her legacy. It was the proof that a woman scorned, mocked, and abandoned could rise not in spite of her pain, but because of it. Her ex-husband's words echoed faintly in her memory. "Without me, you're nothing," she smiled to herself, shaking her head. Those words, once daggers, had become fuel. Every plank she nailed, every calf she saved, every coin she earned had been her answer to him. And though he was far away, living in the shadow of his own arrogance, she knew one day he would hear of her triumph. One day he would see that the woman he mocked had not just survived. She had risen from ashes fiercer and freer than ever. The ranch was no longer broken. It was alive. And so was she. It happened on a brisk autumn morning, the kind of morning when the air felt sharp and the sky stretched endlessly blue. The ranch, for years a place of sorrow and sweat, was about to see its first true victory. She had been preparing for months, working alongside her children, saving every scrap of money, feeding the cattle carefully, and tending to the horses with almost maternal devotion. This wasn't just work, it was her gamble, her one chance to prove to herself, her children, and the watching world that she could not only keep the ranch alive but make it prosper. The big day came when traders from the neighboring town rode in to buy livestock. These were seasoned men, rough around the edges, known for sharp tongues and sharper deals. Years ago, they had laughed at her when she timidly tried to sell sickly calves for a handful of coins. But today, when they stepped onto her land, something was different. The cattle they saw were no longer frail and bony. They were strong, glossy, and well-fed, standing proudly in the corral. Horses stamped their hooves in the dust, sleek and spirited, muscles rippling under the sunlight. The ranch, once broken and mocked, now carried the hum of life and success. She greeted the traders with calm confidence. No trembling hands, no nervous voice. She stood tall, ledger in hand, her daughter by her side, ready with numbers and records. Her eldest son flanked the corral, showing off the animals with the quiet pride of a young man who had worked tirelessly for this day. The traders tried their old tricks, offering lower prices, scoffing, and pretending disinterest. But she didn't waver. She looked them straight in the eye and said firmly, "These animals are worth more than the coins in your pocket. Pay what they're worth or don't pay at all." Her words carried weight. She wasn't begging. She wasn't desperate. She was a businesswoman standing on her own land, commanding respect. The traders exchanged glances, realizing she was no longer the widow they once ridiculed. One by one, the offers came. Fair offers. She shook hands, sealing deals that filled her purse heavier than it had ever been. The first sale was sweet, but the second tasted even better. By the third, she felt the burden of years of struggle lifting from her shoulders. When the last trader rode away, leaving behind a trail of dust and heavy coin purses, she stood there, clutching the earnings in her calloused hands. Her children cheered, hugging her tightly. For the first time in years, laughter echoed across the ranch without bitterness clinging to it. That night, the family celebrated. The kitchen table groaned under the weight of food bought from her honest labor. Bread warm from the oven, roasted meat, sweet preserves. Lantern light flickered on faces filled with joy and pride. Her children looked at her not just as a mother but as the anchor of their survival, the leader of their family, the woman who had carried them from despair into hope. And she herself felt something she hadn't felt in years: relief. For once she wasn't counting every coin, dreading every winter storm. For once she felt that the ranch could be more than just survival. It could be a home, a future, a legacy. With her first real profit, she made bold choices. She invested in better tools, stronger seed, sturdier wagons. She hired 2 ranch hands, young men from the town who worked under her guidance and respected her authority. Every improvement made the ranch stronger, every decision a stepping stone toward greater success. But her victory wasn't just about money. It was about the whispers in town that began to change. The same people who once predicted her downfall now spoke of her determination with awe. At the marketplace, women looked at her with admiration, men with reluctant respect. The story of the widow who had turned a dying ranch into a thriving one spread from neighbor to neighbor, town to town. Yet in her heart, she knew this was only the beginning. Success was fragile. One storm, one bad season, one betrayal could bring it all crashing down. Still, for the first time since he had walked away, she allowed herself to breathe, to believe, to dream. As she stood on the porch that evening, watching the stars light up the wide prairie sky, she whispered softly, "This land will never be broken again. Not while I breathe." It was her first victory, and though she didn't yet know it, it was only the first of many that would make her richer, stronger, and wilder than anyone had ever imagined. It happened when the ranch was finally buzzing with life, when profits had begun to steady, and the neighbors' whispers had turned from pity to admiration. That was when he came back, the man who had walked away, leaving her with a crumbling ranch and children to raise alone, her ex-husband. He rode in on a horse that wasn't even his own, dust rising behind him like a shadow of the past. The same smirk was plastered across his face, the one she remembered too well. That arrogant curve of the lips that once charmed her but later cut like a knife. The children spotted him first. Her eldest son stiffened, his hands tightening on the reins of the horse he was training. The younger ones hovered uncertainly at the barn door. They had lived more years without him than with him, yet his presence stirred memories they could not name. She stepped out from the porch, calm but unyielding, her hands no longer soft and unsure but calloused from real work. Her eyes locked onto his, and for the first time she realized something. She wasn't afraid anymore. Well, he drawled, sliding off his saddle. "Look who's still clinging to this pile of dirt. I thought for sure you'd have sold it by now, or gone running back to town to beg for a man's help." Her jaw tightened. Once his words would have broken her spirit. Now they only reminded her how far she had come. "This ranch isn't dirt," she said evenly. "It's mine. And it's thriving." He laughed, loud and dismissive, walking toward the corral where her healthy cattle stood. "Thriving? These mangy cows? Don't kid yourself. You've just been lucky. Sooner or later luck runs out." But the ranch told a different story. The fences were mended, the barns repaired, the fields green with life. The animals were strong, the land rich. His mocking words clashed with the undeniable evidence of her success. He walked the grounds like a man inspecting something he believed still belonged to him. His eyes lingered on every improvement, every sign of her progress. She saw the flicker in his gaze, the discomfort of realizing that what he had abandoned had not only survived but grown without him. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice firm. He shrugged, but there was calculation behind his smile. "A man's entitled to check on what used to be his. Besides, I heard rumors. Folks say the widow turned her fortune around, and if that's true, well, maybe I made a mistake leaving." The audacity of his words nearly stole her breath. He had mocked, deserted, and scorned her. Now seeing her wealth, he dared to hint at reconciliation. "You didn't just leave," she said, her voice sharp as a whip. "You abandoned us when the barn collapsed, when the debts piled high, when our children cried for shoes. You mocked this ranch and me. Don't you dare ride in here and pretend you care now." Her children watched silently, wide-eyed, but their hearts swelled with pride. They had seen her fight every day, seen her carry the weight of survival. Now they saw her stand unshaken before the man who once made her feel small. But he wasn't done. Pride and greed flickered in his eyes. "Careful," he said with a sly grin. "You think you've won, but you're still just one bad season away from ruin. A woman alone can't keep this up forever. You'll need someone stronger, someone who knows how to handle men, markets, and money." She stepped closer, her shadow falling across his boots. "Stronger? You mean someone who runs when times get hard? Someone who mocks instead of lifts?" No, I don't need that kind of strength. I built this ranch with my own hands. I raised these children without you. And I'll die before I let you claim a piece of it. The air between them crackled with tension. For a moment he looked ready to lash out, but then he smirked again, masking the sting of her words. We'll see, he muttered, swinging back onto his horse. This isn't over. With that he rode off, dust curling behind him like the echo of his bitterness. She stood tall, shoulders squared, her children gathering around her. She could feel their pride radiating, but deep inside she also felt the weight of his words. He wasn't wrong about one thing: success was fragile. One bad storm, one disease, one poor harvest could undo everything. But she also knew something he didn't. She wasn't the same woman he had left behind. She was tougher, wiser, and far from alone. Watching him disappear into the horizon, she whispered to herself, not in fear, but in defiance. Let him come back. Let him mock. This ranch doesn't bow anymore. And neither do I. The ex-husband had returned, bringing with him the ghost of her past. But instead of breaking her, his presence only proved how far she had risen. And little did he know, his return was about to set off a storm that would test them both in ways neither could imagine. The weeks after his return were uneasy. Though he had ridden away with a smirk and a threat, his presence lingered like a storm cloud on the horizon. The ranch was thriving, yes, but she knew her ex-husband too well. He wasn't a man to swallow pride. If he couldn't own the land, he would try to ruin it. And she was right, it began subtly. A neighbor mentioned that he had been spreading rumors in town, that her success wasn't real, that she was secretly drowning in debt, that she had taken money from questionable men to keep the ranch afloat. These whispers stung, but she ignored them. She had endured far worse than gossip. Then came sabotage. One morning she awoke to find the corral gate unlatched and half her cattle wandering dangerously close to the creek. Another night, tools went missing from the shed. Someone had slashed the leather of her saddle. Too many accidents to be coincidence. Her children noticed her growing tension. The eldest son, now nearly a man, clenched his fist with every new act of vandalism. It's him, isn't it? He's trying to break us again. She didn't deny it. Yes, she said, steady but resolute. But we don't break. Not anymore. The real showdown came when he returned, not alone this time, but with 2 men at his side, rough drifters with eyes that measured everything like it had a price. They rode straight into her yard, boots heavy on the porch as they dismounted. He sneered at her calm stance. I hear you've been doing well, richer than you ever dreamed. But this land, it was mine once, and maybe it ought to be mine again. Her heart pounded, but her voice did not falter. You gave it up when you left. It's not yours, and it never will be. His companion stepped forward, towering figures meant to intimidate. A woman like you shouldn't run a place like this, one muttered. Maybe you'd be better off selling, cheap, before something happens you can't fix. Her eldest son moved beside her, his jaw set, but she placed a firm hand on his shoulder. Not yet, this wasn't a battle of fists. It was a battle of will. She squared her shoulders. You think you can scare me into giving up what I built? You think you can ride in with threats and take what doesn't belong to you? No, this ranch stands because we fought for it every single day. And if you think I'll hand it over, you've forgotten who I've become. Her ex-husband laughed, but there was no humor in it. You're one drought, one bad winter away from ruin. And when that day comes, don't think anyone in town will help you. I've already made sure of that. The word sliced deep, for she knew he had friends in town, men who valued his smooth lies more than her hard truths. But she also knew she wasn't alone anymore. Over the years, she had earned respect, not from the gossips, but from the quiet farmers who had seen her toil, from the traders who had dealt with her fairly, from the neighbors who had borrowed her tools and found them returned sharper than before. And right then, as if fate itself answered, 2 riders appeared at the edge of the yard. They were neighbors, men who had done business with her, who had grown to admire her resolve. Seeing her cornered, they dismounted and joined her side. This ranch is hers, one of them said flatly. And if you think otherwise, you'll answer to all of us who've seen the truth. Her ex-husband's smirk faltered. He hadn't expected anyone to stand with her. The drifters shifted uneasily, no longer sure of their advantage. The widow stepped forward, her voice clear and steady. Leave and don't come back. You abandoned this place once. If you try to take it again, you'll find more than just me standing in your way. For a long moment, silence stretched. Then, with a curse under his breath, he swung into his saddle. His men followed, muttering, their eyes avoiding hers. Dust rose behind them as they rode away, smaller than they had seemed when they first arrived. The children rushed to her side, relief mixing with pride. Her eldest grinned for the first time in weeks. "You didn't just face him, Mama, you beat him." She exhaled slowly, the tension draining from her shoulders. "No," she said softly, though her lips curved in the smallest of smiles. "We beat him, together." That night, under the wide prairie sky, the ranch felt different, safer, stronger. She realized that the showdown hadn't just been about defending her land. It had been about proving, once and for all, that the past had no hold on her. The ranch was hers. The future was hers. And nothing, not even the man who once broke her, could take it away. The showdown had ended, but its echoes lingered. For days she caught herself glancing toward the horizon, half expecting to see him ride back with yet another scheme. But as the weeks passed, the ranch only grew stronger, while his shadow faded into nothing. The community had seen it all. Neighbors who once doubted her whispered her name with respect. Traders told the tale of the widow who faced down her ex-husband and his men, standing tall on land she had built from the dust. Even those who had once mocked her now tipped their hats when she walked into town. The change was undeniable. Where once she had walked through the market with lowered eyes, now she strode with confidence, children at her side. And every glance, every nod reminded her that she had rewritten her story, not as a woman abandoned, but as a woman unbroken. The ranch itself mirrored her transformation. Fields stretched golden under the sun. Barns stood sturdy, livestock thrived. With the profits she had earned, she invested wisely. A new irrigation system, fresh seed for planting, stronger timber for fencing. She even set aside money for her children's schooling, determined to give them choices she had never had. One crisp morning, a letter arrived from the county office. Her ex-husband, bitter to the end, had filed a claim, insisting that he still had rights to the land. For a brief moment, the old fear stirred, but it died quickly. She no longer faced battles alone. She took the letter straight to town, where the local council gathered. And when the time came, she stood before them, documents in hand. Every deed, every record, every receipt proving that she had kept the ranch alive single-handedly. The men on the council studied her papers, listened to her story, and finally ruled with clear, final words. The ranch belongs to her, and her alone. That ruling spread like wildfire. Her ex-husband's last attempt to reclaim her life had failed publicly, legally, permanently. When word reached her ears, she didn't gloat. She simply went home, leaned against the porch post, and let the relief wash over her. The children celebrated, cheering, their voices carrying across the fields. Her eldest son lifted her youngest daughter high into the air, and their laughter rang brighter than any victory bell. From that day on, the ranch was not just a home. It was a symbol, a monument to resilience, a story whispered to every woman who had ever been told she couldn't survive without a man, to every farmer who thought ruin meant the end. And she herself changed too. She no longer measured her life by survival, but by growth, by joy. She allowed herself moments of rest, reading by lantern light, walking the fields at dawn, watching her children chase each other in the tall grass. The neighbors began calling her something new, the wild widow of the ranch. Not because she was reckless, but because she had defied every expectation, wilder than her husband had ever imagined, richer in ways he could never touch. As for him, he vanished from the county, his name carried only in bitter mutters. Wherever he went, he was known not as the man who abandoned a failing ranch, but as the fool who left behind the woman who turned it into gold. Her triumph was not just wealth. It was freedom. It was peace. It was knowing that when the world had bet against her, she had proven it wrong. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon and painted the sky in hues of fire, she stood on her porch and watched her children play. Their laughter filled the air. Their feet kicked up dust on land that was truly theirs. She thought of the woman she had been, afraid, doubted, mocked, and she smiled softly. She was no longer that woman. She was the keeper of a thriving ranch, the mother of strong children, the widow who had built something unshakable. And in the silence of that moment, she whispered to herself words that no one else would hear, but that carried the weight of all her victories. This is our land, our life, our triumph, and no one will ever take it from us. The prairie wind carried her words across the fields, through the barns, and into the endless night. The ranch stood tall under the stars, no longer broken, no longer fragile, but whole, just like her. It was the final triumph of a woman once mocked, now richer and wilder than ever.